Pleasure to welcome everybody, also on behalf of Irene Giviashvili and Gerhard Wolf, to the event of this Tuesday afternoon. Natia Natsvlishvili's talk on bell towers in medieval Georgia, architecture and ritual. Her presentation is part of our renewed series of lectures on the art of Georgia and more broadly the Caucasus, which is organized by the KHI in cooperation with the George Chubinashvili National Research Center in Tbilisi. The lecture series currently takes place once a month and brings together the most prominent scholars in the field. I'm especially delighted to welcome and introduce our today's speaker. Natia Natsvlishvili is senior researcher in the Department of Medieval Art at the George Chubinashvili National Research Center. In 2019, she received her PhD from the Ilia State University in Tbilisi for her research in the history and architecture of the Catholic churches in Georgia, which are also one of her major research fields. Natia Natsvlishvili has got several scholarships and awards and participated in many scientific events. From 2015 to 2018, she participated in the Traveling Research Seminar Program for Early Career Researchers Crossing Frontiers, Christian Muslims and their art in Eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus, which was part of the Getty Foundation initiative connecting art history and was organized by the Consecration of Art and headed by Anthony Eastman. Since 2009, she has been actively involved in numerous cultural heritage management and preservation projects in Georgia, such as in a project on urban planning and architectural design in Georgian cities from 1801 to 1918, or in a project on Polish cultural heritage in Georgia. Moreover, Natia Natsvlishvili is currently working on a project for the conservation of the major church in Chvari Monastery at Msreta, headed by David Kosteria. Natia Natsvlishvili's research interests include construction methods of medieval master builders, fortifications of the Justinian age, urban planning, and female patronage of art and architecture in medieval and early modern Georgia. Her rich bibliography cannot be listed in detail here. Therefore, I will just mention a few of her most important titles. Natia Natsvlishvili is co-author, together with Dimitri Tumanishvili and David Kosteria, of the monograph Master Builders in Medieval Georgia, published in 2012 in Georgian and 2020 in Japanese. And she contributed to the books Church Buildings in 19th Century Tbilisi, Architecture and Identity, published in 2016. And as well as Urban Planning and Architectural Design in the Cities of Georgia, published in 2019. Most recently, in 2020, she also published an article on the Catholic churches of the Holy Family in the town of Gori, a research which I suppose was also part of her PhD thesis. Natia's talk of today will open up yet another horizon. She will discuss the development of the religious soundscape in medieval Georgia and give a general overview of the architecture of bell towers in Georgia. Before handing now over the screen to Natia Natsvlishvili, I would like to remind you of a few practical matters. We kindly request that you do not record this event and that you mute yourself during the lecture. After the lecture, please turn on your videos for the discussion in order to ask questions directly to the speaker. The discussion will be moderated by Irene Giviashvili. Please, Natia, we are very much looking forward to hearing your presentation. Please share your screen.
Thank you very much, Annette, for this kind introduction. Now I will share my screen.
Great. We see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The bell tower is a relatively late architectural structure for the East Christian world. In the early Middle Ages, the architectural landscape of monasteries and cities in the Byzantine Empire and its eastern neighbors did not include bell towers. Moreover, for a long period of time, bells themselves were not in use in the church practice of this vast region. While in the Latin West, bells were employed from as early as the 6th century, the Eastern Church preferred a semantron a wooden plank or board struck with a wooden mallet as an instrument of convocation. Hagiographic works and Typica attest to the fact that early medieval Georgian monasteries also used semantra, thus following common Eastern church practice. Several passages from the life of Saint Gregory of Hansta, written in the mid-10th century, by describing events which occurred a century earlier, mention striking or knocking something to summon monks to the divine service, without giving a name to or specifying the material of the instrument. In all probability, this unnamed instrument was the semantron. Taking into consideration that in the early Middle Ages, the Georgian church was closely connected with the Church of Jerusalem, and that Saint Gregory chose Typicon of the great lover of Saint Sabas for his monasteries, one can assume that the semantron was introduced to Georgian monasteries from the Holy Land. According to John Moscus, in Palestine, striking the wood for liturgy was already a well-established tradition by the early 7th century. In fact, the largest number of examples originated from sources about semantra in the early Byzantine period is related to Palestine. The Georgian equivalent of the Greek word semantron, saregeli, literally means a device for striking and is mentioned in early medieval texts. The Georgian translation of the well-known Book of the Cave of Treasures, made in the 9th or 10th century, says that Noah struck a saregeli, that is a wooden board with a mallet, to call together the builders of the ark. Another more general term for the semantron is zeli, which corresponds to the Greek word xylon, that is wood. The use of the semantron seems to have been standardized in medieval Georgia, at least from the 10th century. Once the instrument was made, the ritual of its consecration took place. This liturgical practice is documented in the 10th century Georgian manuscript from Mount Sinai. Other sources from a much later period repeat this text without significant variations. The ritual of the consecration started outside the church walls, where the semantron was washed with holy water. Then it was moved into the church, erected in front of the cancelleria and smothered in incense. A litany and a special prayer recited by a deacon and a priest respectively completed the consecration ritual. The prayer reveals the symbolic meaning of the semantron, the sound of which repeats the sound of the hammering of nails into the limbs of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion. It smashes the devil and allows believers to worship. The belief in power of the semantron sound against demonic forces is documented in the encomium of Saint Theodosius the Canobiarch, written in 530. Another symbolic interpretation of the semantron is its comparison with the trumpets of the angels that will awaken all people on Dam's Day. From the 11th century onwards, Georgian written sources better describe the rule of use of semantra. They are often mentioned in the Great Synaxarion or the Typicon of Hagia Sophia, translated into Georgian in 1042 by the famous monk George the Hagiorite and accepted in a number of monasteries in Georgia. The Synaxarion regulated the use of the semantron on feasts and ferial days. It seems that following the Studious Monastery and the Atonite Lavra, Georgian monasteries with this particular typicon used only wooden semantra. Indeed, the above-mentioned text describing the consecration of the instrument only refers to the portable semantron, which can be easily transported and placed within the church space. A detailed description of the rule of the striking of the semantron for liturgical hours is given in the typicon introduced for the royal monastery of Shiombuime by King David the Builder. It mentions not only the types of instruments, the big and small wooden semantra and an iron one, but also the way to strike and rhyme, for instance, slowly and with intervals. Use of 3 or 4 semantra is attested to in several monasteries in the Byzantine world from the late 11th to the 13th centuries. Among the monastery of the Mother of God, Evergetis, the monastery of St. Mamas in Constantinople, and the monastery of the Mother of God of Machairas on Cyprus. In Georgia, the typicon Shiombuime provides the only evidence for the use of 3 semantra. Apart from announcing liturgical hours, the semantron was used for convocation when something important had happened and the attendance of brethren was required. Its sound also marked the boundaries of the sacred area around the church. As the 13th century rule attests, a special punishment was foreseen for those who conducted themselves inappropriately or stole anything outside church walls, but within earshot of the sound of the semantron. None of the documents mentions the place of the instrument within the church or the monastery, but one can assume that stationary semantra were usually located in arched galleries and porches, while small ones could hang next to the entrance door of the church. Another sound-producing instrument, also known to have been employed in monasteries from the mid-11th century, was a handbell. According to the great Synaxarion, it was sounded by a steward at the refectory to gather monks for the common meal. From the 16th century, the role of the meal was added to some Georgian editions of the Typikon of Xion. Apparently, the handbell and the refractory semantron were functional interchangeable instruments in medieval Georgian monasteries. Thus, all the above-mentioned sources show that the use of the semantron was a part of everyday religious life and century-long tradition in medieval Georgia. In fact, it was never expelled or completely replaced by the bell, and its sound continued to be a part of the religious soundscape over the centuries. A deed composed for Larguisi Monastery in 1470 mentions both the bell and the semantron, proving that both were in use. Jean Chardin, who visited Georgia at the beginning of the 1670s, wrote of the existence of the same practice in Samegrelo, Western Georgia. According to Chardin, the metal needed to make bells was very expensive and local people could not usually afford it. If the church owned a bell, then it was often a small one. Rarely, some churches had both instruments, but following the century-long church tradition, the semantron was struck in first place. As such, when talking about the distribution of bells in medieval Georgia, one should take into account regional differences caused by varying local traditions, economic situations, availability of materials, etc. Until recent times, the introduction of bells into the Eastern Church practice was usually ascribed to the Latins. More precisely, it was associated with the Fourth Crusade and the fall of Constantinople in 1204. However, this opinion has been challenged by modern scholarship. Indeed, sources indicate that some monasteries used bells for at least a few decades before the Crusaders captured Constantinople. The Typikon of the Monastery of the Mother of God, Cosmosodei Rania Pera, composed in 1152, mentions two bells hanging high up in the tower in place of semantra. The capture of Thessaloniki, written by Eustathius of Thessaloniki, which describes events that took place in 1185, refers to large bells in the Basilica of St. Demetrius. However, their exact location is unknown. There is also evidence suggesting that bells were already in use in Serbia and Bulgaria in the 12th century. In general, the situation is similar to the Caucasus. It is commonly believed that Georgians began to employ bells for religious purposes in the 13th century, although an earlier date cannot be completely ruled out. Sources do not say much about bells. One of the earliest references can be found in the 13th century document entitled The Rules for Coronation. However, it mentions a bell used in a secular rather than religious ceremony. According to the document, it was part of the regalia of the king, ahead of the royal procession that started in the palace and moved toward the cathedral. A bell, flag, and spear were carried. This bell would have been small, similar to those usually decorating the king's collar. The earliest church bell in Georgia is known of thanks to a century-old publication by Josip Orbeli, according to which a bell was kept in the seaside Georgian town of Poti, and in the early 20th century was sent to Russia to the owner of a bell factory. Its fate thereafter is unclear. Orbeli did not have an opportunity to examine the bell himself and relied only on a photograph when studying it. Analyzing the abundant decoration on the bell, Orbelli suggested that it was made in the 12th or 13th century and belonged to a bell tower in the city of Ani or in its adjacent region. The decoration of the bell may indeed indicate its Armenian origin, but it is hardly convincible that it was made before the 13th century, especially if it came from the city of Ani. According to Quintamar's historian, Christians in Ani were called up to the morning worship by the striking of a semantron. Moreover, the only bell tower in Ani known from an inscription found in the ruins of the Church of the Savior was built in 1271 or 1291. The oldest preserved examples in Armenia are two large bells from Tatar Monastery. According to their inscriptions, they were cast in 1302 and 1304. In Georgia, one of the oldest church bells was found during an archaeological study of so-called Rusudas Monastery in Samtskhe, founded in the 14th or 15th century. It was hidden under human remains in the monastic ossuary. According to its inscription, written in Georgian and some Targuli letters, it was made on the order of Abbot Gabriel. The inscription doesn't contain the date of casting, but on paleographical grounds, it can be dated to the 14th or 15th century. That is, the bell would have been contemporaneous to the foundation of the monastery. After the conquest of Samtskhe by the Ottomans in the 1578, the bell was buried in order to prevent its confiscation, which was a common practice in the regions under Ottoman rule. The earliest preserved bell in Georgia with an exact date was cast in 1514 and donated to the Church of St. George in the village of Gomareti by a local Lord Alexander. According to the donor inscription, this bell replaced a small one, which attests to the use of bells of various sizes in medieval Georgia. Written sources say that bells became widespread from the 16th century. The easternmost Georgian kingdom of Kakheti seems to have been the main center for producing bells. Workshops in Kakheti supplied bells not only to local churches, but also to those in other regions of Georgia, including the remote mountainous province of Svaneti. There are at least 10 bells in various churches in Svaneti with inscriptions mentioning King Alexander of Kakheti or his family members, which means they were cast between 1592 and 1605. Why an intensified relationship between Svaneti and Kakheti existed in this period remains open to discussion and needs further research. The majority of the bell masters in Georgia remain anonymous. However, one bell does bear the name of its master, Zedan Titadze, once again showing the practice of making bells occurred locally. Extensive use of bells in the South Caucasus is attested to in the construction of numerous bell towers from the 13th century onwards. The purpose of this new architectural structure is explained by chronicler Kyriakos Gantzaketsi in his History of Armenia. While listing new buildings erected in Harpad Monastery by Bishop Hamazas, Gantzaketsi mentions a marvelous structure adapted in style to the church where the bell was hung. According to the donor inscription, its function was to awaken those who praise the Lord. Built in 1245, it is the oldest securely dated bell tower in the South Caucasus. In Georgia, the first bell towers were erected exclusively in monasteries. Owing to their vertically elongated shape, they became a new noticeable feature of the monastic scenery. The sound of bells ringing from a height was much deeper and louder than that of the semantra. Thus, the bell towers introduced sensory changes to the sacred landscape in a way that had a significant effect on both the local sight and soundscape. The early bell tower was a two-story freestanding structure. While its upper part, the belfry proper, had only the function of housing the bells, the lower part could serve several purposes. For instance, as an entrance gate, a crypt, or a chapel. The elaborated architectural design of early bell towers in Georgia led some scholars to believe that the first bell towers appeared in the 12th century. However, their existence before the 13th century is confirmed neither by written sources nor by material evidence. The bell tower in Ijareti Monastery is considered to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, in Georgia. The once flourishing monastery now stands in ruins. The bell tower, though very damaged, is the only surviving architectural structure in it. Initially, it was a two-story building with a large lower part topped with a belfry with open arches. The belfry and most of the facade eschlering have gone. The lower part of the bell tower served as a chapel, accessible through the southern door and illuminated by one window cut into its eastern wall. A facing of greenish tone is preserved only on the eastern facade, which is decorated with a blind arch, a quote in the window frame. Taking into account the architectural details and ornamental decoration of the building, Vahtank Beridze convincingly dated the bell tower to the mid-13th century. The older securely dated bell tower was built in 1278 at Gudarechi Monastery by Abraham, mentor of the king Demetre II and his messenger to the bishops. In the donor inscription, the bell tower is named as Samreklo, which literally means a place for ringing and does not specify the instrument itself, contrary to the Armenian word Zangakatun, which directly points to the fact the building is intended for ringing a bell. Iosif Orbeli suggested that the word Zangakatun was invented and introduced in the late 13th century. The Gudarechi bell tower is a two-story building. Originally, it was included in an enclosure wall, and its lowest story served as the rear entrance gate of the monastery. Now, with the majority of the defensive wall gone, it appears as a freestanding structure. The ground floor, open through two penetrating arches, is square in plan. Its upper part shelters a dwelling place for a bell ringer, reached by a stone staircase arranged in front of the western wall. The vault of the room is now completely destroyed, and its space merges with that of the arched belfry. The facades, faced with yellow and brown-hewn stone blocks and arranged so as to make a checkerboard pattern catch the eye. The polychromy of the facade even overshadows the floral and geometric ornaments, decorating the cross panels, window frames, and other architectural elements of the building. Another bell tower dated to the late 13th century stands in Galati Monastery. Founded in 1106 by King David the Builder. To the northwest of the main church, there is a spring and a pool covered with a structure that is square in plan and opens through arches on three sides. One can assume that this structure was the equivalent of the Byzantine fiale, but it's speculative on this stage of the research. Later, this building was altered to accommodate a bell tower above it. The first floor above the original structure shelters a low vaulted room, which was used as a prison from time to time in the late Middle Ages. The arched belfry can be reached by a stone staircase arranged in the wall. The facade eschlering of yellow sheep limestone and the decorative framings of the belfry arches resemble the main church of the monastery. As can be seen from the other examples too, bell towers were usually linked to the style of the main church in order to achieve architectural integrity within the monastery. The following centuries saw extensive construction of bell towers, following a plan and design well established by the end of the 13th century in all parts of Georgia. Many of them were built in the southwestern provinces of Georgia, which in the mid-16th century was annexed by the Ottoman Empire. Unlike in the lands of the former Byzantine Empire, bell towers here never became subject to intentional destruction. In fact, some of the oldest and finest buildings have survived in this region, despite their being a part of the Ottoman Empire for almost 3 centuries. For instance, the bell tower in Sapporo Monastery, see bell tower here, standing on a steep slope and overlooking the churches and chapels. For a short period of the 14th and 15th centuries, the bell tower became a favorite place for masons to depict themselves. This can be explained by the less sacral function of the bell tower, which encouraged builders to feel free to represent themselves on their walls. These marginal images are a vivid illustration of the alternative cultural world of the Masons. A twin representation of builders is carved above the arch of the belfry or bell tower at Zarzma Monastery, built around 1300. The front-facing male figures are dressed in simple short garments and hold pickaxes in their bent arms. Since the main church and bell tower were built at the same time, it is obvious that the latter was chosen on purpose for the representation of the Masons. Modesty and humility is expressed in small size of the figures. Another sculptural image of a master builder appears on the bell tower in Gergati Monastery and dates back to the mid-14th century. The small front-facing figure of a bearded man holds a square and a plumb line. An inscription identifies him as the stonemason Grigol. Sporadic material evidence from medieval Georgian art demonstrates the application of drawings in the building process. Ruisi Cathedral of the Mother of God is distinguished for the unique depiction of working drawings of the church. The arch at its western entrance and the arch in its western entrance, and what is most important to us, a bell tower on its northern facade. These were drawn in the early 15th century by master builders working on the order of King Alexander I on the restoration of the cathedral after Tamerlane's devastating invasions. In the drawing, the bell tower is painted in red and gray and represents a two-story simple structure open through arches on both floors. There is a horizontal wooden beam shown under the capitals of the belfry columns. These types of beams we are used to hang the bells on. It is probable that this is a draft architectural design of a bell tower which was supposed to be built. The extant bell tower in Ruisi is of a much later date and has a completely different design. A unique example of a bell tower topped with a sculpted model of a church is preserved in Khansta Monastery in Klarjeti province, now in Turkey. The bell tower was built in the 1540s, shortly before the Ottomans conquered the region. A model of the church, which served as the base for the cross, is erected on the summit of the stone roof of the 16-sided arched belfry. It represents a heptaderon building with a plain facades, except for the northern one, which is recessed, thus imitating a door opening. The top of the model is now broken off, but the lower part of the roof is preserved. Its zigzag line was evidently inspired by the design of the dome roof of the nearby standing church, in the shape of a half-open umbrella. We know from the written evidence that the Church of St. George at Khansta, constructed in the 910s and 920s, was recognized as an architectural masterpiece even in the life of its master builder Amona. Thus, it's not surprising that 6 centuries later, the builders of the bell tower imitated the shape of its dome, the most characteristic and identifiable feature of the church. As a rule, bell towers built in the 16th and the 17th centuries show a more developed design. The 4th-story bell tower of Ninotomino Cathedral, built in full brick masonry, is a remarkable landmark of the precinct. Apparently, it was of the same height or even taller than the now ruined cathedral. Its large rectangular tower, topped with a light belfry, contains dwelling rooms equipped with inner staircases, fireplaces, and built-in coppers. Bell towers were also built in Georgian monasteries outside Georgia, for instance, in Ivrion on Mount Athos, whose bell tower is depicted with a hanging bell in a mid-18th century drawing by Timothy Gapashvili. I have already mentioned the bells sent to Swaneti by the kings of Kakheti. Apparently, most of them were hung on wooden beams or trees. However, there were also a few belfries. Unlike in central parts of Georgia, where the architectural form of a bell tower was inspired by that of the church dome, in Swaneti it resembles a fortified dwelling tower typical of the region. To summarize the above said, the following conclusions can be drawn. In accordance with the common Eastern Church practice, the sematron was the main instrument for convocation in early medieval Georgia. Adopted from the Holy Land, it became standardized from the 10th century. From the 13th century, the religious soundscape became more diverse as bells began to be employed in Georgian churches. The introduction of bells led to the emergence and development of a bell tower as a functionally corresponding architectural form, the typology and design of which developed over the centuries to represent a noteworthy aspect of medieval Georgian architecture. Thank you very much for your time and attention.